After endless months of hardcore effort by journalists, women activists, a number of people involved in the Me Too movement, what have the actual legal implications of that been? What actual progress on the books have we gotten? It turns out there is a bill, and we're gonna talk about how important it might be. We're joined now by editorial fellow and Mother Jones, Marisa Endicott. Welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on. And I want to talk about this bill. So Democratic lawmakers have a bill hoping to provide additional protections, particularly for people in the service industry. Now, I come up through the service industry, so I have a little bit more understanding of how rough an area that can be necessarily, but it is particularly hard on women that are serving in those sorts of jobs. Can you talk a little bit about why that's an important industry to provide, to have specific protections added in?
Sure. So the service industry, and particularly the restaurant industry, is a huge industry in the US. It employs 13 million workers. It's one of the fastest growing in the private sector. It also has a very large number of women, people of color, immigrants, people who tend to be particularly vulnerable to harassment. And, as a lot of the news coverage has revealed, people working in the restaurant industries experience, and other service industries as well, experience a really high level of sexual harassment.
Yeah, and in your piece at Mother Jones, you talk about how, we're familiar with some of the more public jobs in the service industry, but there are people who go to people's homes and work in their homes. It's very private, and they can be victimized without necessarily anyone knowing about it. And some of the examples that you list are just horrendous. And so, with this bill that was announced last month, what do the Democrats actually want to do to change the situation?
Yeah, so it's a really kind of sweeping bill, but the parts that are particularly interesting are the protections for low-wage workers. One of, I'd say, the most interesting protections that they're looking to push forward is getting rid of the tipped federal minimum wage. So in the US, you have the federal minimum wage, which is about $7.25, and then there's the tip minimum wage, which is for workers who receive tips. They have a much lower minimum wage, which is just $2.13 an hour. And 17 states adhere to this lower minimum wage for tipped workers, and then there's 7 states that actually require that tipped workers have the same minimum wage as all other workers. And then the rest of the states are somewhere in between. So that means in the majority of the country, tipped employees are under immense pressure to keep the customer happy at all costs. And that results in a lot higher risk of harassment. And so basically this bill would get rid of the federal tip minimum wage altogether.
And of course, they have to keep the customers happy, but also in some of these examples, their money is being sort of routed through a manager, perhaps. So it provides additional financial power that these people have over someone who that's their income. The actual check that they'll get on their actual wage. I mean, as a former waiter, I know that $2.13 sounds bad, but it actually works out to basically nothing because your taxes take away all of that. All of it is tips in the end. So in terms of actual ability to have some sort of legal strike back against managers or people in positions of authority who are abusing these people, are there teeth to the legislation in that area?
Yeah, so I would say there's quite a few actual processes that this bill would implement. There's legal grants to help low-wage workers, low-income workers actually file claims against their employers. There's an expansion of, there's limits to things like non-disclosure agreements. And I would say one of the biggest benefits would be, and this touches on something you mentioned before, where you have a lot of situations where you have domestic workers or small businesses where it's just a few employees and there's like a lot less oversight. this bill would expand the coverage of the Civil Rights Act. So under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employers are prevented from discriminating against their employees on the basis of race, sex, religion, and that includes protections against sexual harassment. But as it stands, that only applies to businesses with 15 or more employees. So you have huge swaths of the working population that have no ability to file federal claims. One congressional report actually found that 10 to 17% of workers are unable to file federal claims under Title VII because of the fact that they are part of small businesses and that kind of thing. So this would be a pretty big game changer to expand those rights to people like interns, independent contractors, house cleaners, quite a few.
There was one other area I was curious about, though, because in particular, some of the industries that you're talking about, it might be the case that people with, like, what I'm wondering is immigration status, how that intersects with some of these industries, and where you have financial vulnerability, you also have vulnerability perhaps legally where you're worried about what might happen. It seems like that's a community that would be even more vulnerable to the harassment and abuse of various sorts. Does the legislation include considerations for people of varying immigration statuses?
That's a really good point. So there is an expansion of protections for immigrants as well. I'm not sure how far that goes, but definitely, as you said, there's particularly like farm workers and domestic workers, there's a lot of them will be are particularly vulnerable because of their immigration status and as well as language barriers and other vulnerabilities. And so I do know that this expands by expanding the coverage of the Title VII, they will get further protection as well as being able to access kind of like these grants or sources of like legal protections and legal advice that should help to protect at least some of these people who have definitely been left out.
Well, that is very good news, and I would like to imagine that we live in a world where Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate will give this legislation a serious look. Hopefully that will be the case. I'm not willing to bet on that necessarily, but I appreciate both your write-up, which is available at Mother Jones. People should go take a look at that for more examples of how this would actually impact individuals' lives. But Marisa, we really appreciate you joining us on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.